and welcome to the Deep Dive. So today we're analyzing an event that's really the ultimate shortcut to understanding how naval supremacy just completely shaped the modern world.
It really is.
We're heading back to October 1805 off Cape Trafalgar in Spain. And this isn't just another battle. This is the moment. A single, brilliant tactical move secured one nation Britain total dominance for over 100 years.
A whole century, yeah. It's incredible.
So our mission today is pretty clear. We really want to get into how Admiral Horatio Nelson, who was facing a much larger fleet, pulled off a victory so complete that not a single British ship was lost.
Not one.
We're going to dissect that strategy, figure out what made it so terrifyingly effective, and then look at the huge geopolitical payout it delivered.
And to set the scene for you, the stakes. I mean, they just could not have been higher. This was a battle of absolute necessity.
This wasn't a choice.
No, not at all. Napoleon was dattering his forces. He was ready for a full-scale invasion of Britain. And if that combined French and Spanish fleet had gained control of the Channel, but that would have been it.
The invasion would have happened.
It would have. So Trafalgar was the last desperate, definitive move to stop that from happening.
And the numbers alone really underscore how big of a gamble this was. You're looking at an enemy fleet of 33 ships.
A huge force, nearly 30,000 men on those ships, all formed up in this massive defensive line.
And against that, Nelson has what?
He's got 27 ships and about 18,000 men. So right from the start, they are seriously outnumbered. In ships, in sailors, you name it.
So how do you win that?
Well, that's the fascinating part, isn't it? Nelson knew he couldn't win by playing their game. The victory wasn't going to be about matching them man for man. It was about taking a calculated, aggressive, and frankly, a terrifying risk to maximize his own strengths.
Okay, let's unpack that risk, because this is where the genius of it all lies.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at naval combat for centuries before this, it was all about one thing, the line of battle.
Right, it was rigid. Two fleets sail parallel to each other. And
just fire broadsides, right? The whole side of the ship firing at once. It was very formal, almost like a dance, and very slow.
And Nelson he shredded the rule book. He saw that those parallel lines, all they really did was cause damage to both sides. You rarely got a quick, decisive win.
And if the fight drags on, the bigger fleet usually wins.
Exactly. So Nelson's idea was the complete opposite. He wanted pure chaos, aggressive, overwhelming force.
So instead of forming a line parallel to theirs, he splits his fleet
into two columns, like two spears. And he aims them straight at the enemy formation, not alongside it, but perpendicularly through it. The idea was to just punch a hole right in their center.
Okay, but that perpendicular approach, that's the revolutionary part. But it's also a massive gamble, isn't it?
Oh, a monumental gamble. You have to understand, when your ship is sailing head-on towards an enemy line,
you can't fire your main gun.
Exactly. You can only bring a few guns at the bow to bear. Meanwhile, the enemy ships you're approaching can fire their entire broadside into you. For that whole approach, you are a sitting duck.
So for minutes on end, the lead ships, like Nelson's own HMS Victory, are just soaking up damage without really being able to fight back.
Mm-hmm.
Why on earth would you take that risk?
Because the payoff, if you make it through, is instantaneous, catastrophic chaos for the enemy.
Right.
The second you breach their line, you shatter their command structure. But even more important, you get to use something called raking fire.
Okay, explain that.
Imagine you're on a French ship. The line's just been broken. A British ship sails right across your bow or your stern, the weakest, least armored parts of the ship. And it fires a full broadside that travels down the entire length of your deck. That's raking fire. It didn't just damage the ship, it was murderous. One shot could wipe out every cannon, every man on that gun deck. It's a morale killer, an equipment killer. And Nelson's whole tactic was designed to create that situation within minutes.
So he turns it from this formal long-range duel into a brutal close-quarters brawl.
A melee. Exactly where the British wanted it, because that's where their training advantage was just immense.
And we know who led that charge. Nelson himself, right. In the HMS Victory, leading the first column, aiming straight for the enemy flagship.
He did, and his second-in-command, Admiral Collingwood, on HMS Royal Sovereign, led the second column, hitting the line further down. So it was a dual-pronged attack. Because he couldn't focus on one threat, they were being broken in two places at once.
This is where that technical superiority really comes in then. It's not just the strategy, it's the execution. What were these specific advantages the British crews had?
Well, there are a few huge ones. First off, just relentless training. The British gun crews could reload and fire much, much faster than their French or Spanish counterparts. We're talking maybe 3 shots for every 2 from the enemy.
In a chaotic fight like that, speed is everything.
It's everything. Second, they had better technology. They used flintlock firing mechanisms on their cannons, which were way more reliable than the old matchlocks, especially in wet conditions. And then they had a secret weapon.
The carronade. The smash.
The smasher, precisely. A short, stubby cannon that fired a massive cannonball at very close range. It wasn't for dueling, it was for obliterating the hull and rigging of an enemy ship when you were right up next to it.
So when they broke the line and got in close.
Those carronades just turned the enemy decks into a slaughterhouse. That's the key link.
Okay.
Nelson's genius strategy was designed to create a fight that perfectly leveraged his crew's superior training and this specific deadly technology.
So let's walk through the fight itself. It kicks off around noon.
Yep. And the Victory and the Royal Sovereign take a real pounding on the way in, just as expected.
Right.
But they don't stop. Collingwood's Royal Sovereign actually gets through first, smashes the line, and immediately unleashes this devastating raking fire into the stern of a Spanish flagship.
And the chaos begins.
Total chaos. The British ships just pour through the gaps that have been opened up. The French and Spanish line, once it's broken, it just loses all cohesion. Commands are useless. It becomes every ship for itself.
And the final result, after about 5 hours of this brutal fighting, when you compare it to the numbers at the start, it's just unbelievable. What was the final count?
It's historic for a reason. By the end of it all, the combined Franco-Spanish fleet had lost 22 ships.
22.
Captured or destroyed. Their casualties were in the thousands. It was a complete rout.
And the British losses, what was the cost for them?
This is the truly staggering part. 0 ships lost.
0.
0. Not a single British ship was sunk or captured. That one statistic tells the whole story of just how total this victory was.
But it did come at the highest possible price. In the middle of the fight, on the deck of the Victory, Nelson was shot.
He was hit by a sniper from the French ship Redoubtable. He was shot pretty early in the melee, actually, but he lived for a few more hours.
Long enough to know they'd won.
Long enough to be told that the victory was complete and decisive. His death at the very moment of his greatest triumph is what instantly turned him from a brilliant admiral into, well, an immortal national hero.
So let's talk about what that victory actually buys Britain. This wasn't just about winning a battle. It laid the foundation for the entire British Empire for the next century.
The immediate effect, obviously, was just the complete and utter destruction of French naval power. Napoleon's dream of invading Britain, that died at Trafalgar. It was now permanently off the table.
Which meant his backup plan, the economic war, was also basically doomed.
Exactly right. He tried to implement this continental system, basically a huge blockade to stop anyone in Europe from trading with Britain to try and cripple them economically.
But you can't enforce a blockade without a navy.
And he didn't have one anymore. Trafalgar meant British merchants could sail anywhere, the Atlantic, Asia, Africa, and keep that economic lifeline going that would ultimately fund Napoleon's defeat on land.
That's the short-term impact. But you mentioned a century of supremacy. How does one battle guarantee that?
It secured what historians now call the Pax Britannica, the British peace. With no other European power able to challenge them at sea, Britain could stop worrying so much about defending its own shores.
That's a huge strategic freedom.
It's immense. All that money and energy could be poured into industrial expansion, global trade, and colonial administration. British trade routes were safe. They could project power anywhere on the planet without a real challenge. Trafalgar basically gave Britain a 100-year head start to become the world's first global superpower.
And Nelson's death just cements that whole narrative, doesn't it? He becomes the human symbol of this newfound security. You see it everywhere, even today. His funeral, the HMS Victory, still preserved in Portsmouth.
Absolutely. His legacy is tied to that innovative tactic, for sure, but it's also tied to this larger idea that decisive sea power is the ultimate guarantee of a nation's security and prosperity. Trafalgar is still the textbook example of that.
A really powerful deep dive. So for you, the key takeaway is that Trafalgar wasn't won just because of better ships. It was Nelson's genius in throwing out the rule book, using that terrifying perpendicular attack to create chaos. And that move, which perfectly exploited the superior training of his crews and the power of their guns, delivered a victory so total, it basically removed Britain's biggest rival from the map and bought a whole century of global dominance.
And that dominance was bought with a life, which, if you connect it to the bigger picture, it raises a really interesting question for you to think about. Nelson becomes this mythic figure because his ultimate sacrifice and his greatest victory happen in the very same moment. But what if he'd survived the battle? You have to wonder, would his tactical genius still be held in such a sacred, almost religious regard? Or was his death the necessary ingredient to cement Trafalgar's untouchable, enduring myth?
A fascinating thought. Thank you for sharing your sources and for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are sailing straight into one of history's most tactically brilliant confrontations, the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805. Our mission today isn't just to, celebrate a victory. It's to crack the code of Admiral Horatio Nelson.
Right, to really analyze how he took naval warfare, ripped up the rule book, and just permanently redefined it in a single afternoon.
And it was a rule book that had been around for a long time.
Oh, a very long time. I mean, Nelson was challenging nearly 200 years of orthodoxy. Before 1805, naval combat was all governed by the fighting instructions.
And what did that mean in practice?
The default mode was the line of battle. You get two fleets, they sail on these perfect parallel lines, and they exchange broadsides.
So it's just about attrition then?
Exactly. It was often drawn out, highly predictable, and, it was rarely decisive.
It sounds less like a battle and more like a formalized sort of rigid procession where you just hoped you had more cannonballs than the other guy.
Precisely. It was a failure of imagination, really. Nelson saw this rigid approach as totally inefficient. He realized that if you could achieve a rapid, decisive victory,
You negate their numbers.
and at Trafalgar, the combined French and Spanish fleets outnumbered the British, and quite significantly.
So that's the core question, isn't it? How did he create that decisive moment? We know he was aggressive, but what was the specific combination of audacious tactics, technology, and that radical leadership that let him achieve it?
Well, there are about 5 key innovations he brought together that day.
Okay, let's unpack them.
Let's start with the fundamental shift, which is really about the geometry of the attack.
Right, the first big move, Nelson completely jettisons the parallel line of battle. He just throws it out.
Gone. Instead of sailing alongside the enemy, he divides his entire fleet into 2 separate columns.
2 columns. And you have to picture this, right? The massive French and Spanish line is stretching for miles, totally ready for that traditional side-by-side fight.
And instead of giving them that, Nelson launches these 2 highly concentrated columns, one led by himself on HMS Victory, the other by Admiral Collingwood.
And the maneuver was to sail straight at the enemy line, perpendicular to it.
Yeah.
Why risk that head-on approach? I mean, that leaves your lead ships incredibly vulnerable, doesn't it?
It does, but it was a calculated risk for an overwhelming reward. The whole point was to breach the enemy line, not just anywhere, but at 2 specific pre-planned points.
And where were those points?
Near the rear third of the enemy formation.
Why there specifically?
By hitting the line in the rear third, Nelson made sure that the leading ships of the French and Spanish line, the van, with the fresh crews, were physically cut off.
So they couldn't turn around in time to help.
Exactly. They were effectively taken out of the fight for the crucial opening phase. The goal was just immediate, irreparable disarray.
So once the British column smashed through, the battle just transforms.
Instantly. It goes from a disciplined line exchange into these swirling, isolated melees. And that chaos, that was the environment the British were explicitly trained to win in.
You turned it into a street fight on water.
A series of street fights, yeah, where individual ships could be isolated and overwhelmed.
Which brings us directly to the incredible danger of that approach.
It does, because that aggressive formation required a phase the sailors grimly called the run-in.
Right, because for that long, agonizing period, sometimes 30, 40 minutes?
At least.
That the British ships are sailing head-on, they can't fire their powerful broadsides back.
Only the few small chase guns on the bow could be used. Meanwhile, the entire enemy line could concentrate its fire on those incoming lead ships.
And that's the core of the calculated risk, isn't it? Nelson intentionally exposed his lead ships, including his own flagship, HMS Victory, to that withering fire.
He did. It was an acceptance that the first few ships in each column would take a devastating amount of damage before they could even return effective fire.
But wait, if the French and Spanish could see this happening, that the Victory was sailing right for them, why didn't they just concentrate every single cannon on that one ship and stop the plan cold?
That is the beauty and the confidence behind the risk. They absolutely did try to.
So what was Nelson banking on?
2 things. First, the enemy fleets were largely inexperienced. They'd been blockaded in port for years. Their gunnery was slow, and frankly, inaccurate.
Okay. And the second thing.
Second, Nelson was reversing the tactical disadvantage of what was known as crossing the T.
Where one ship sails across the vulnerable bow or stern of an enemy.
Right. Nelson let the enemy cross his T's during the approach. He accepted the hits because he knew that once he broke through, he would then be positioned to cross the enemy's T at point-blank range.
And that's where his superior crews would just dominate.
That was the plan. The risk was front-loaded, accepting inevitable damage because he was confident the opponent simply lacked the skill to sink him during that window of exposure.
So if the enemy had been as good as the British, the plan would have been suicidal.
Completely. He was relying on the fact that they couldn't reload fast enough or aim well enough to stop the breakthrough. His confidence in his crews was everything.
Which brings us perfectly to the next point. The technological and the training edge. What actually made his crews so much better.
The training was just relentless. A British gun crew could fire a full broadside, reload, and fire again in about 90 seconds.
90 seconds. And the French or Spanish?
You were looking at 3, maybe 4 minutes.
Wow. That's a massive difference.
It's a huge difference in rate of fire, and it was amplified by a piece of tech that most people don't realize was so revolutionary at the time.
Tell us about the hardware. You're talking about the gun locks.
The flintlock gun locks, yes. This is a detail that often gets lost in the big tactical picture, but it's critical.
So before this, they were using what? Slow-burning matches.
Slow matches, yes, or linstocks. And they were incredibly temperamental, especially in bad weather. The British, however, were widely equipped with these advanced flintlocks.
Like a giant flintlock rifle trigger on a cannon.
That's a perfect analogy, a mechanical device ensuring a nearly instantaneous, highly reliable spark, no matter the weather. That means consistent, rapid fire.
And in the close quarters, melee Nelson was planning for.
The ability to get off 3 or 4 broadsides for every 1 or 2 the enemy managed was the difference between winning and just total annihilation.
So tech reinforces the training.
It does. And there was another key weapon, the carronade.
The smasher.
The smasher, or the devil gun.
Yeah.
It was the perfect complement to Nelson's tactics.
How so? What did it do differently?
Well, a standard long cannon fired a solid shot meant to punch a hole through a hull from a distance. The carronade was short, wide-bored, and designed specifically for close combat.
The exact range Nelson was forcing the fight into.
Exactly. It fired a much larger, heavier shot at a lower speed. It wasn't designed to penetrate deep, but to shatter and splinter the target's wooden structure on impact.
So the splinters themselves become weapons.
Deadly shrapnel. At point-blank range, a carronade broadside didn't just injure sailors, it shredded the deck, the rigging, the bulkheads. It was about maximizing psychological and structural damage very, very quickly.
That is gruesome, but strategically brilliant. It guarantees that once you get in close, the fight is decided fast.
It provides the assurance that the high-risk run-in was worth the price. The whole plan was a perfect synthesis, but none of it works without the final piece.
Leadership.
Leadership.
The Nelson touch. His command structure.
Yeah.
It almost feels modern, doesn't it? This idea of decentralized command.
It was incredibly modern. This is where Nelson truly transcended his contemporaries. He knew that once the battle started, with all the smoke and chaos, signaling would become impossible.
So he didn't want his captains just sitting there waiting for orders that would never come.
Exactly. So he spent time with them beforehand, explaining his strategy, what he famously called the Nelson touch. And his core instruction was breathtakingly simple.
What was it?
No captain can do very wrong if he places his ship alongside that of an enemy.
That's just extraordinary trust. He's basically telling them, here's the mission's intent: cause chaos, destroy the enemy in close combat. Now you figure out how to do it in the moment.
That's it. This system of mission command was revolutionary. Every captain understood the goal, so if they saw an opportunity, an isolated French ship, a gap in the line, they had the autonomy to seize it instantly.
It turns 27 ships into 27 thinking commanders, all working toward the same goal. That adaptability must have been terrifying for an enemy used to a rigid, predictable opponent.
It was decisive. Think of his famous signal just before the battle. England expects that every man will do his duty.
Yeah.
That wasn't an operational order. It was a psychological reassurance, reinforcing the trust he'd already placed in them. When the chaos descended, that trust ensured the whole fleet kept functioning dynamically.
So the outcome is less about a single admiral directing traffic and more about a unified, dynamic organism overwhelming a rigid structure.
Beautifully put.
So let's bring this all back for everyone listening. Trafalgar wasn't just a victory. It was this comprehensive demonstration of how to win.
A perfect blend of high-risk strategy, superior tech, and radical leadership.
Right. So let's quickly synthesize those 5 pillars. First, the geometric innovation, breaking the line with 2 columns to guarantee chaos.
Second, accepting that extreme risk during the run-in, which was justified by his absolute confidence in his crews.
Third, the reliance on advanced flintlock gun locks for that superior rate of fire.
Fourth, the use of those devastating close-range carronades, which were perfectly tailored for the melee he created.
And finally, the modern principle of decentralized command, empowering every captain.
And the result was, while it was devastating, the combined fleet lost 20 ships, the British lost none.
No.
Not a single one. This single afternoon secured British naval supremacy for the next century and permanently ended Napoleon's ambitions of invading Britain.
The tactical rebellion succeeded, but the sources always bring us back to the personal cost.
They do. Nelson lived by his tactical risk, and he died by it.
He was mortally wounded, wasn't he, by a sniper?
Yes, during the close quarter fighting aboard the Victory, he died just hours after learning of his decisive win. He accepted the highest level of known personal risk by leading from the front, and that risk materialized at his moment of greatest triumph.
Which leads us to that final provocative thought for you to consider.
Nelson knowingly accepted that his flagship would absorb withering fire, sacrificing initial safety to ensure the breakthrough. And it makes you wonder, when we look at leadership, whether it's in business or military strategy or innovation, does a true strategic breakthrough, one that permanently changes the landscape, ever come without the leader personally embracing the absolute highest level of known danger during that critical, unprotected opening phase of the plan?
A profound point on the relationship between leadership and personal risk. That's a deep dive into the tactical genius of Admiral Nelson and the permanent legacy of Trafalgar. Thank you for walking us through that.
A pleasure.
If you want to explore the detailed sources we discussed today on the carronades, the gun locks, the Nelson touch meadows, they'll be linked in your personal notes. Until next time, keep digging.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So you sent us a whole stack of material this time, all focused on one single moment, the death of Admiral Horatio Nelson. Battle of Trafalgar, 1805. And on the surface, it feels like a simple story, a huge victory, but a tragic loss. But the more we dug into this, the more of a paradox it becomes. So our mission today is really to unpack that. How does the death of your greatest military hero, how does that become a massive boost to morale? It just seems counterintuitive.
It's the ultimate historical trade-off, isn't it? And your sources really nail this. I mean, on one hand, Nelson's death was a genuine trauma for the nation, real deep public mourning. But that loss was inseparable from the victory. And that combination gave them the perfect narrative tool. His sacrifice guarantees naval supremacy, it ends the terrifying threat of a French invasion, and it basically becomes the moral fuel for the rest of the war.
Okay, let's unpack that. Let's start with the battle itself. Trafalgar, 1805. This wasn't just a win against Napoleon.
No.
It was. It was an annihilation of the French and Spanish fleets. It secured the seas for Britain. Strategically, a very clean result.
A completely clean result. And that right there is the first part of the morale boost. But we need to talk about why that naval supremacy was so much more than just, defending the coastline.
Right, because this is where it gets interesting. It's not just about stopping an invasion. It's about the economy, isn't it?
It's all about the economy. It guaranteed the global trade routes.
Yeah.
Without them, Britain starves. Simple as that. And crucially, it can't pay for its allies on the continent to fight Napoleon. Think about the insurance markets alone. A French fleet in the Channel means insane risk premiums for shipping.
So all of a sudden,
Trafalgar just slashes that threat. Trade stabilizes, insurance rates drop, and the Treasury can confidently fund the campaigns in Spain and Portugal later on. Yeah. It's safety and economic stability in one single stroke.
So the whole country just collectively breathes this huge sigh of relief. They're safe, they're financially secure, but at that exact same moment, they're heartbroken.
Completely heartbroken.
Because Nelson was the face of that security. And the sources are clear. This wasn't just the elites mourning him. It was everyone.
And that widespread personal grief is absolutely key to understanding the myth that comes next. Nelson was genuinely popular. He'd been sort of marketed for years as the embodiment of the British spirit.
So the mourning wasn't just an abstract thing in the papers?
Not at all. It was visible. It was a unifying national event. People were wearing black armbands, commemorative ribbons for months.
Wow.
And you had thousands of these popular prints and engravings of his death scene being sold. They were like, well, they were mass market propaganda, really.
Yeah.
And the mourning itself becomes this huge patriotic symbol. Every person wearing a black ribbon is saying, I'm with the crown, I'm with the cause he died for.
And that's the pivot point, right? You have this genuine unifying grief colliding with the geopolitical win of the century. The government must have looked at that and seen a golden opportunity.
Oh, they absolutely did. And it wasn't an accident. This was a masterclass in building a political narrative. His death didn't just reinforce his legacy, it amplified it. It turned him into a martyr hero. And that process started almost immediately.
But hang on, wasn't there a risk that the public would see that as cynical? You know, this huge state funeral, all these monuments, it could look like the government was just cashing in on real sorrow.
That was the tightrope they had to walk. And the key was how they framed it. It was all about duty, about personal sacrifice. It was never about government glory. They focused on Nelson's last words, his bravery,
right,
his dedication. And that made the whole spectacle feel like a genuine homage. And by elevating him, they elevated the cause he died for. And that allowed them to push three really critical political goals, all under the cover of national grieving.
Okay, let's hear them. How was that sacrifice actually put to work?
Well, first, they used his image to lock in long-term public support for the war. I mean, remember, these wars are long, they're expensive, people get tired of them. But when you have a martyr like Nelson, his sacrifice becomes the moral justification to keep going. It's not just a strategic war anymore. It becomes a moral crusade.
And his name itself was so tied to naval power, it fulfills that second goal. It makes naval dominance feel like a moral duty.
Exactly. And the third goal was even bigger. It was about bolstering British national identity against Napoleon's massive empire. Nelson became the symbol that Britain had something France didn't, an unmatched moral courage. The spirit of Nelson was in every sailor.
So the government had to move fast to make that narrative stick. How did they, how did they institutionalize it? What did that look like on the ground?
It was huge, carefully choreographed public theater. Take the state funeral in early 1806. It wasn't just a burial. It was probably the biggest state procession London had ever seen. They chose the roof specifically so the maximum number of people could see it, to create this shared tangible experience. And the cost was just astronomical. That was a deliberate statement. It was a way of saying, this is how much his sacrifice is worth to the nation.
That scale is so important. It's not a gesture. It's a massive institutional investment in the story.
Precisely. And they kept investing for decades.
Yeah.
Look at the monuments. Statues were commissioned immediately. And then, eventually, you get Trafalgar Square.
The literal heart of London.
Right. Dedicated to this one man and this one battle. These aren't just tributes. They're constant physical reminders that Britain is safe because a hero was martyred. It carves the national identity right into the stone of the city.
What's so fascinating there is that to create that perfect martyr, you have to be selective. They had to clean up the story a bit, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. The Nelson myth required some careful editing. They needed a pure hero of duty. So the official biographies, the government messaging, they just downplayed or ignored the messy parts. His very public, very long affair with Emma Hamilton, for example.
Right, that gets swept under the rug.
Completely. The focus had to be rigidly on duty, God, and country. That sanitized image was essential for unity. They needed a hero everyone could admire without any complications.
So they're not just memorializing a hero. They're actively defining what a hero is for the new British Empire. Okay, so let's talk about the long game. The war drags on until 1815. How does Nelson's legacy keep working for years after the shock has faded?
That's the real test of its success, isn't it? His legacy moved beyond just the Navy. It inspired the whole country. For the military, of course, he became the benchmark for how to be an officer. But for the public, his memory became this emotional anchor point for patriotism. So when taxes were high or the news from the continent was bad, thinking about Nelson and Trafalgar was a kind of moral reassurance that the fight was worth it.
So his death almost allows the war to shift from being about, a raw struggle for survival to something more, a moral certainty.
That's a perfect way to put it. The two things together, the victory and the martyrdom, they symbolize a turning point in the psychological war. The government used that moment to paper over internal political cracks. I mean, the politicians could argue about strategy or money, but nobody could argue about Nelson's heroism.
He was the one thing everyone could agree on.
The one non-controversial rallying point that helped keep the whole war effort together for another decade.
So the victory gave Britain the strategic breathing room it needed. but the myth of the death gave it the moral stamina to keep fighting.
That's the synthesis right there. His death was a moment of genuine, profound mourning, and at the same time, a brilliantly engineered political rallying point. It stabilized the country's resolve when it was most needed, and became the moral bedrock for the eventual victory over Napoleon.
It's just astonishing how a loss that big was transformed so quickly into such a powerful, positive political force. It really did guarantee British security and cemented the justification for its entire global project.
It really shows us that the biggest historical events, they're often less about the facts on the ground and more about the narrative that gets built around those facts.
And that brings us to our final thought for you to take away. We've seen how Nelson's death was deliberately leveraged with spectacle, with monuments, with messaging to keep a long, costly war going. So if the survival of the nation really depended on manufacturing this perfect hero narrative, what does that tell you about the role of martyrdom in sustaining any long and difficult conflict? How often do we rely on these carefully curated stories of sacrifice to keep going? Something to think about.